Let's start at the end, because the end refuses to sit anywhere else. Susan Barrantes lies in a vault under the floor of the house she lived in on the Argentine pampas, a short walk from the polo field she and her second husband cut out of flat grassland near a town called Tres Lomas. No churchyard in Hampshire, no family plot in England, no marble, no ancestors, none of the people who spent 26 years expecting her back. Under her own floor, in Argentina, roughly 7,000 miles from St. Margaret's, Westminster, where at 18 she walked up the aisle on the arm of a lieutenant in the Life Guards while the honorable relatives watched and a man from the Times copied her name down for the marriage notices. Everyone in that church assumed they knew how her life would run. Not one of them landed anywhere near it. Most people encounter exactly one version of this woman, if they encounter her at all, and that version arrives pre-flattened, the mother of Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, one sentence deep in the royal wedding coverage, usually with a sting in the tail about how she abandoned her children for a polo player. A Scottish broadsheet printed that as an obituary headline. September 1998, days after a head-on collision on a provincial highway, and the Herald ran the words, "Mother who left her children for a polo player," over her death notice. Geez, dude. 61 years of a life, priced at a single line above the fold. So that's the frame I want to poke holes in. The woman British society filed under scandal spent the whole second half of her life breeding horses on the far side of the planet, nursed a husband through cancer until the bills swallowed her land, sold half her estate to an Australian billionaire, founded a television production company in her 50s, published a book at 60, and rode through London in an open carriage beside the Duke of Edinburgh on live television. People don't usually generate two biographies that incompatible. Susan generated both, and everything worth an hour of your time lives in the gap between them. I'll tell it in order, mostly. Susan Mary Wright arrived on 9 June 1937, which parked her toddler years inside a country about to spend several years under nightly bombing. Though her particular family owned enough property and knew enough people to absorb that decade far more comfortably than the average English household. Her father, Fitzherbert Wright, served as a military officer before sitting as a company director. Doreen Wingfield, her mother, carried the honorable in front of her name because Doreen's own father, Mervyn Wingfield, held the title 8th Viscount Powerscourt. 8th. Not the first, not the second, but the 8th, meaning the Wingfields passed that title down the way other families passed down a slightly ugly clock, and nobody in the house treated it as news anymore. Now, the Wrights. This next bit requires a confession about doing history on the internet, because early in the research I kept colliding with a claim that the Wright family owned Nottinghamshire land going back to the 16th century. Tudor money! Dissolution of the monasteries money! I chased that claim backward through source after source, each one citing the last, until the trail dead-ended in an unattributed hobbyist blog post from 2009 with no author beyond a first name and no citations whatsoever. So it's gone. Sorry. What the record actually supports comes from the obituary. The Independent ran on 22 September 1998. The Wright family built its wealth and its land holdings across Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire in the late 18th century, and the engine of that wealth carried a name still stamped on Victorian ironwork across the Midlands. The Butterley Company, founded 1790. Butterley meant iron, and iron meant canals, railways, bridges, and the physical machinery of an industrial economy about to eat the world. A family sitting on that business in 1790 bought itself a permanent seat at the table of the British upper classes, which is the ledger Susan inherited 147 years later. Not ancient nobility, industrial money, laundered upward through 2 centuries of well-chosen marriages, one of which handed her a viscount for a grandfather. Comfortable, conventional, entirely predictable from the outside. Nowhere in that opening chapter does anything forecast a vault under a farmhouse in Buenos Aires province, which tells you how little the opening chapter of anybody's life is worth as a prediction. The wedding took place on 17 January 1956 at St. Margaret's, Westminster, a church that sits in the literal shadow of the Abbey and that the London establishment treated for centuries as its own parish chapel. Run her birthday against that date, and you land on an 18-year-old bride. My students turn 18. I have personally watched an 18-year-old attempt to microwave a burrito with a metal fork still buried in it, and here sits a girl the same age signing a document that, by the rules of her class in 1956, determined the shape of every decade she had left. Ronald Ivor Ferguson, the groom, had reached 24 and held the rank of lieutenant in the Life Guards, one of those regiments where horses and ceremonial breastplates form part of the actual job description. He would climb to major eventually. History remembers him by that later rank, and nearly every retelling of this marriage quietly promotes him 20 years early, which bugs me more than it probably should. On his wedding morning he ranked as a lieutenant, and the Times printed him that way in the marriage announcements on 18 January 1956. Tiny correction, I know. Nobody's life turns on the distance between a lieutenant and a major, but the tiny corrections tell you whether the person writing actually opened the archive or simply copied the previous guy, who copied the guy before him, back and back, until you reach some poor soul in 1996, typing from memory in a hurry. Claridge's, in Mayfair, hosted the reception, which even in 1956 signaled a certain altitude. That detail floated around the write-ups for years with a question mark bolted to it, tagged unverified, passed along by people who clearly wanted it to be true. Then somebody pulled the 1956 Times report and found it sitting there in plain type alongside everything else. So the portrait comes together like this. Teenage bride from an industrial fortune with a viscount in the branches, cavalry officer husband, Mayfair Hotel, a church a stone's throw from Westminster Abbey. Place a bet that morning on where Susan Mary Ferguson would be standing in 1975, and you'd have chosen Hampshire, horses, dogs, gin, a husband advancing steadily through the ranks, and eventually an obituary describing her as the devoted widow of the late Major. You'd have lost that bet by 7,000 miles. Ascot came first, and then the Fergusons relocated to Dummerdown Farm in Hampshire, which functioned as the family's base from then on. Jane arrived in 1957, Sarah followed in 1959, and their mother had barely cleared her 22nd birthday by the time the second one showed up. 2 daughters, 1 English farm, ponies and cold mornings, and a father whose entire existence orbited the military and, increasingly, Polo. That's the whole documented middle stretch of her first marriage. I want to level with you about that, because this format carries an enormous temptation to fill 16 years of somebody's private life with mood lighting and invented interiority, slow piano, sepia photograph, narrator confidently informing you that she must have felt trapped in that farmhouse. Nobody wrote those years down at the time. The 2 people best positioned to describe them later described 2 different marriages, which forms the subject of a chapter coming up shortly and which, honestly, supplies the reason this video exists at all. What the record does support runs simply enough. From 1956 to 1972, Susan Ferguson lived the exact life her wedding day predicted, on the farm, with the girls, married to the officer, 16 years of it. She entered that marriage at 18 and walked out of it at 34, which covers precisely the span most of us spend working out who we actually are. And she did the whole thing while already being somebody's wife and somebody's mother. Then she left. Hector Barrantes, Argentine, professional polo player, and in 1972 Susan Ferguson eloped with him. Eloped, not separated, not commenced proceedings. None of the careful legal vocabulary the English upper classes spent centuries developing for precisely this situation, specifically so that no newspaper would ever need to print the sentence. The Times eventually printed in her obituary. She ran. The farm, the marriage, the country, all of it behind her, and her daughters, 15 and 13 years old, remained in England. Polo forms the connective tissue running through this entire story, so let me lay that groundwork properly before we go further. Ronald Ferguson built his life around the sport as an officer, an administrator, and a permanent fixture of the English polo world. Argentina, meanwhile, produces the finest polo players on earth, by a margin nobody seriously disputes. And English polo, through the 60s and 70s, imported Argentine professionals, the way English football clubs import strikers. The man Susan Ferguson ran off with didn't wander in off a random street corner. Hector emerged from the exact world her husband inhabited, spoke its language, rode its horses, appeared on its calendar, and would have been perfectly unremarkable at any party the Fergusons attended. Polo delivered her the farm in Hampshire. Polo then removed her from it, which is either irony or symmetry, and I've stopped trying to decide which. The divorce came through in 1974, 2 full years after her departure. Sit inside that gap for a second, because 1970s English divorce for a family of that visibility translated into 2 years of solicitors, letters, awkward Christmases, and a great many people in Hampshire discussing her at dinner parties she would never attend again. 2 years of being talked about in the present tense by a county she no longer lived in. The record splits clean down the middle at this point, and rather than picking whichever half produces the better television, I'd rather walk you through both and let you sit with the mess. Susan's account, given in later years and reported by the Herald around the time of her death, runs like this. The marriage had been deteriorating for a long stretch before she ever met Hector, and her husband's infidelities finished it off. Not one bad week then. A slow structural collapse, with Ferguson's affairs knocking out whatever support beam had still been holding the thing upright. Ronald Ferguson disputes her on the central charge, and he disputes it in print in his 1994 memoir, The Galloping Major. He rejected the picture of chronic unfaithfulness. 2 brief affairs across 16 years of marriage, he admitted, and he argued that the actual cause of the divorce arrived suddenly and from outside the house. His wife met a polo player and left with him. Notice that those 2 accounts barely contradict each other on facts. Both parties agree affairs occurred, so the argument concerns weight rather than events. And the whole question comes down to whether 2 affairs constitute a pattern that hollows out a marriage from the inside, or 2 isolated failures inside a marriage that functioned perfectly well until an Argentine walked through it. Nobody alive can adjudicate that, certainly not me, and I want to flag how differently the 2 versions reach us. Hers arrives secondhand, through journalism, after her death, filtered through a reporter and an editor and a headline writer with a moralizing streak. His arrives in a book he wrote and sold about himself 20 years after the divorce, in a decade when his daughter's marriage into the royal family had converted the whole family into a tabloid industry with its own economics. One version belongs to a dead woman who can never revise it, the other belongs to a living man with a publisher, an advance, and a reputation to defend. What strikes me hardest is the shape of the disagreement itself. He defends a number, 2 affairs over 16 years, as though a low enough figure settles the matter, while she describes a condition rather than a count. People inside collapsing marriages argue about arithmetic when the thing they actually disagree about is the temperature of the house. Let's take it head on, because ducking it would prove gutless. She left 2 children behind, Jane at 15 and Sarah at 13, and their mother crossed an ocean and stayed on the far side of it for the rest of her life. The contemporary British press seized on exactly that, and the fingerprints stayed visible 26 years later. The Daily Telegraph's obituary in 1998 notes how heavily the papers of the period had focused on the children left in England, while the Herald went ahead and ran Mother Who Left Her Children for a Polo Player, as its headline in the same week her body came out of a wrecked car on provincial Route 33. An entire generation had passed between the elopement and the obituary, and the framing hadn't shifted a single inch. One remark from Sarah circulates constantly through the retellings, and I want to hand it over with the packaging intact rather than stripped for parts. Describing her mother's attachment to Hector Barrantes, Sarah reached for the word obsession, and that word has since been lifted out of context and deployed as a weapon in roughly 1,000 articles by people who never checked where it came from. It came from hindsight. It appears in Giles Brandreth's account from 2018, spoken by a woman looking back across decades, and in the same conversation she describes the reconciliation that eventually followed between mother and daughters. That context changes what the word does. A daughter reaching for a hard noun to explain something she watched happen at 13, while telling you in the same breath that the family found its way back together, performs a completely different act from a daughter issuing a final verdict on her mother. The reconciliation drops out of most retellings anyway because it clutters up the morality tale, and you can see why it gets dropped. Nobody can comfortably run the headline, "Mother Who Left Her Children for a Polo Player," over a story that ends with the mother waving from an open carriage beside the Duke of Edinburgh at her daughter's royal wedding. On live television, while the papers that wrote the headline fight for the best angle, will reach the carriage. Chichester, West Sussex, hosted the second wedding in 1975. So, England again, 3 years after the elopement and 1 year after the divorce, and only then did she formally pack up her life and relocate to the Argentine pampas for good. Most tellings compress that sequence into, she ran off to Argentina in the 70s, and the compression cost something real. Eloped 1972, divorced 1974, remarried 1975 on English soil in a cathedral city roughly 70 miles from the Hampshire farm she'd walked out of. She never vanished over the horizon in one dramatic night, whatever the headlines preferred, and instead spent 3 years dismantling one life in full public view before assembling the next one, then the Pampas, and then El Pucará. The Barranteses developed an equestrian estate near Tres Lomas dedicated to breeding polo ponies, which nobody should confuse with a hobby or a comfortable retirement in the sun. Polo pony breeding operates as an actual agricultural industry in Argentina, and running one properly demands land, bloodlines, staff, grooms, feed, veterinary competence, and a tolerance for working days that start before sunrise and involve a genuinely heroic quantity of manure. Consider the distance traveled, and forget the 7,000 miles for a moment. A woman raised with a Viscount for a grandfather, married out of Claridge's at 18, finished up running a horse breeding business on the flat grasslands of Buenos Aires province, in Spanish, in a country most of her English contemporaries could not have located on a map beyond the one with the beef. 23 years she stayed. Whatever label you want to hang on her decision in 1972, she clearly never treated it as a fling. The building continued well past Hector's lifetime, too. Later in her life, she founded a television production company to make documentaries about polo, and in 1997 she published a book titled With an Absence of Ceremony. I find completely delightful. Polo. 60 years old, widowed, running a diminished estate on the Pampas, and the woman starts a production company from a farmhouse in Tres Lomas. Sarah Ferguson married Prince Andrew at Westminster Abbey on 23 July 1986, and the full apparatus rolled out for it. Crowds, carriages, global broadcast, the lot. Susan attended, obviously, and the place where this story turns loud concerns the carriage assignment, because she rode through London in an open-top landau alongside Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, in front of the cameras and the crowds and every newspaper picture desk in Britain. You need to understand how those decisions work. Nothing in a royal procession happens by accident, and the question of which relative sits in which carriage beside which member of the royal family gets settled well in advance by people whose entire professional existence consists of preventing incidents. Placing the bride's mother, the woman British newspapers had spent 14 years framing as the runaway, next to the Queen's husband in an open carriage on live television, amounted to a public announcement with no ambiguity in it. The press read the announcement exactly that way, and readmission became the word. BBC archival coverage of the day records the carriage ride, and British reporting ran in the same direction across the board. Whatever the papers had decided about Susan Barrantes in 1972, the royal household visibly decided something else in 1986. Sit inside that reversal with me for 1 second. A woman becomes a social pariah for leaving a lifeguards officer, and 14 years later she's waving from a landau beside the Duke of Edinburgh, and the only variable that changed in between is which prince her daughter married. The British class system doesn't run on principles, it runs on a scoreboard. Quick housekeeping note, since I've been transparent about sourcing the whole way down, that carriage ride kept appearing in write-ups, cited to the caption on a stock photography listing, which nobody should mistake for a historical source. Given that it's commercial metadata typed at speed by somebody paid per image, the BBC's own archive carries the fact properly, so the BBC is what we're using. Cancer killed Hector Barrantes in 1990, and it took its time about it. Prolonged illness costs money, and by the time it finished, the Barrantes finances lay in ruins, with the Daily Telegraph's obituary laying out the arithmetic without any decoration at all. His long decline drained them so completely that Susan eventually sold off roughly half of El Pucará, half the estate. The thing they built together, the thing she traded her entire previous existence to build, cut in two and sold because the medical bills refused to stop arriving. Kerry Packer bought it. The Australian media executive commanded money on a scale that let him purchase pieces of foreign countries as a leisure activity, and he ran his own polo operation besides, so the land never actually left the sport. It simply left her. 8 years remained to her after Hector's death, and she spent them working. The production company, the Polo documentaries, the book in 1997, all of it produced by a widow in her late 50s and early 60s, holding half an estate and choosing to construct something new out of the single subject she'd spent 2 decades mastering. That stretch interests me far more than the scandal does. It's also the stretch nobody covers, and the reason seems obvious enough. Widow keeps business running after selling half her land to pay for her husband's cancer. Will never move a newspaper the way runaway mother moves one. So the last 8 years of her life vanish from the record, while 1972 gets retold forever. On 19 September 1998, Susan Barrantes drove a Rover 400 along Provincial Route 33 in Argentina, and her car struck a Renault traffic catering van head-on. Rafael Barrantes, her 25-year-old nephew, rode with her and survived the crash. Jose Maria Rodriguez, the van driver, survived it too. Susan didn't. The medical detail Clarin reported turns genuinely ugly, so I'll state it once and move along. She wore no seatbelt, the collision decapitated her, and her funeral proceeded with a closed casket. 61 years old, a provincial highway in Buenos Aires province, a catering van. No lesson lives inside that, and I keep circling the same 3 facts looking for one. Every other beat in this story contains a decision, somebody weighing something and choosing something and accepting the cost of it, whereas this beat contains only physics, a road surface, and the specific bad luck of one afternoon in September. She outlasted a scandal that trailed her for a quarter of a century, outlasted her husband's cancer and the collapse of her finances and the sale of half her land, and then a van. They buried her at El Pucará, in a vault beneath her house, next to the polo field. Which returns us to where this video opened, and which strikes me as an unusual thing to do with a body, and which settles the question of where she considered home to be more firmly than any interview could have. 23 years in Argentina by then, with every one of her obituaries printed in London. I want to spend a few minutes on how this story reached us, because it works as a small case study in how history goes wrong quietly, without anybody lying to anybody. Within hours of the crash, international broadcast reports carried the detail that Susan Barrantes died driving a Land Rover, and the Associated Press footage from 1998 states it flatly. That footage now sits on YouTube, uploaded in 2015, feeding a fresh generation of writers who assume that anything stamped Associated Press archive arrives pre-verified. She drove a Rover 400. Local police records confirm the standard saloon car, and the Argentine papers La Nación and Clarín reported from those records rather than from an international wire in a hurry. Does the gap between a Land Rover and a Rover 400 alter the meaning of her life? Obviously not, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But watch the mechanism operate, because the mechanism repeats everywhere, and it repeats in stories where the stakes run considerably higher than a model of car. A wire service, working at speed, reporting from another continent, on a story about a British aristocrat in horse country. Hears Rover and produces Land Rover, because a Land Rover matches the picture the brain has already assembled. That report enters an archive, the archive reaches YouTube, and the upload then gets cited as a primary source by people who never checked what the local police wrote down in Spanish. Her burial went the same way. Plenty of write-ups will tell you she lies buried under the polo field itself, which produces a better image and drifts slightly off what the Independent actually printed. The vault sits beneath her house, adjacent to the polo field. One preposition slides half a meter, and a woman ends up interred under a sports pitch. Then there's the Nottinghamshire land in the 16th century, which I mentioned near the top of this video, and which traveled outward from an anonymous blog into general circulation purely because it read well. None of these errors originates in malice. Everyone originates in somebody preferring the version that scans better, which is exactly why I keep boring you with which paper printed what in which year, and why the bare minimum anybody owes a woman flattened into one headline for 26 years involves getting her car right. So, I lied to you a little at the beginning, not about the facts, about the frame. I opened by telling you this concerned a woman British society filed under scandal, and I set the hour up as a rehabilitation. That classic move where a narrator arrives 60 years late to announce that everybody in the past judged somebody unfairly, and only he can see clearly. The record won't quite carry that play, and I'm not running it. Look at what actually sits in the file. A 34-year-old woman left a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old in England and moved to the other side of the world, and however unhappy her marriage, however unfair the coverage, however genuine the reconciliation that eventually followed, those two girls grew up without their mother in the house. Sarah's own word for whatever pulled her mother away, reached for decades afterward and softened by everything that came in between, remains obsession. I won't talk anybody out of that. And also, the same woman built a working horse breeding business from nothing in a country she never grew up in a language she never grew up speaking, and stuck with it through 23 years, a cancer, a funeral, and the forced sale of half of everything she owned. She founded a production company in her 50s and published a book at 60. She rode through London beside the Duke of Edinburgh, while the same papers that had shredded her jostled for the photograph. Both columns, simultaneously, one person. My objection isn't to the judgment, it's to the economy of the judgment. British society priced her entire existence at one sentence in 1972, then kept charging her that identical price for 26 years. Right through to the obituaries that ran the sentence one final time while her family arranged a closed casket in Argentina. A person earns more than one sentence, including a person who did the thing everybody agrees she did. She lies under the floor of a house near Tres Lomas, beside a polo field, 7,000 miles from St. Margaret's, Westminster, where an 18-year-old walked up the aisle in January 1956 while a reporter from the Times copied her name down for the morning edition. Both of those places exist on a map right now, and only one of them holds her.